His obsession and rage over the time she spent with anyone other than him, including her family and her best high school friend, are completely over the top. Friends remember screaming fights, constant tension. As early as spring, they recall, Nina was passing Maggie notes in class, calling her whore and slut. Those names that we saw applied this year to a young woman who had the nerve to assert that her medical care should cover contraception. The thing about those two words is that they have no male equivalent. They're used only for women, to identify and punish women who are seen as transgressing some boundary. Over the summer of '99, Maggie tried hard to talk to Nina about independence within a relationship, allowing each other space, acknowledging each other's involvements with friends and family. In response, he wrote that he had once seen her as, quote, a God-sent angel, but now, and I quote again, all of a sudden you've turned into some feminist telling me this, that, and the other. Now, folks, I know the opposite of angel, and I don't think it's feminist. Or maybe it is. A second warning sign is past violence. No, Nina never hit Maggie, at least not that we know of. But he did other things. He was constantly fighting with male friends and acquaintances, or challenging them to fights, or bragging about past altercations, or his prowess with karate. When a woman he had dated 3 times ended the relationship, he put his fist through a window. After a fight with Maggie, he punched through a closet door in his dorm room. But the past violence is often violence that the perpetrator himself has experienced as a victim. In fact, violence that is suffered or witnessed in childhood is one of the most reliable predictors of adult violence among men. Nenef told friends that his father physically abused his mother, and that Nenef himself was beaten when he brought home unacceptable grades. Which brings me to the third warning sign over Nenef's head, one that comes from his family story. It's the story of an immigrant family, and I know many of you here today are children or grandchildren of immigrants to this country. So you know that immigrants tend to invest a lot of time, money, and care in their children's academic and professional success in this country. That was true of the Otis. But on top of this, Nenef had a severely patriarchal father who exerted way too much pressure. One of his friends told me that very few K students could have understood the kind of pressure he was under because of his family's ethnic and immigrant background. But on another level, this story is shared by a lot of college students who struggle under inordinate pressure to succeed academically. Over the summer of '99, Nenef didn't know whether his father would allow him to return to school. He wasn't satisfied with Nenef's performance in his sophomore year. Nenef negotiated his return, but only on 2 conditions: that he get a 4-point in the fall, and that he not have any women in his life. Just amazing demands to put on a 20-year-old. This ultimatum came precisely as Maggie, alarmed and frustrated by Nenef's jealousy, his immaturity, his rages and verbal abuse, and his constant interrogations and pressure, was withdrawing from the relationship. Get the picture? For Nenef, it must have felt like his life was unraveling. In the eyes of his father and in the culture of academic overachievement that prevails at places like K, he was failing. And he lost Maggie, his one good thing. His reported behavior and his writings suggest severe depression. In fact, men who abuse women are often not the domineering guys we imagine, but they're opposites. Men who are depressed, feel disenfranchised or marginalized or powerless, and are anxious about their masculinity and their power to keep a woman. They are often the men who will never be the alpha males in American society, and that's one of the combination of forces that drives them to murderous violence. In an email to a friend, and also in his suicide note, Nenef wrote that his life had been nothing but pain for 20 years. He had been thinking about suicide, and he told his roommate that over the summer he had attempted to buy a gun while he was home in Seattle, planning to kill himself. According to statistics, there is nothing more dangerous to a woman than a partner or ex-partner who is suicidal and who has access to a gun. On October 9th, 1999, Nina simply borrowed his roommate's car, drove out West Main Street to a store called On Target, and told them a tale about a prospective hunting trip up north with friends. With that and a Visa card, he was able to buy himself a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun and ammo for $347.62. He insisted that the shotgun be camouflage colored. He listed his address as 1200 Academy Street with a Hicks Center box number. Why a shotgun, you might ask? Over 41% of murder-suicides are committed with handguns. But with his handgun, you see, he would have needed a permit, and that would have taken time and a background check. With a shotgun, all he needed was a credit card. As he handed it over, was he planning to kill Maggie, or only himself? Did he decide to take her with him when he saw her with her date at the homecoming dance? Shouldn't someone have known that he was so close to the edge? Shouldn't people have known he was still harassing Maggie by email and telephone about getting back together? Shouldn't Maggie have known somehow that she was in danger? Maggie. Where was Maggie all this time, as Nina was spiraling downwards? I haven't said much about her, and I guess that might seem strange. When we speak about violence against women, it's almost always about women. And usually the first question to raise its head is, why did she stay with him? In other words, what was wrong with her? Which is why I've concentrated on Nina. I am sick to death of that question. And Maggie Wardle's murder is evidence of why it is the wrong question to ask. She didn't stay with him, she left him. And that was precisely the problem. The greatest danger for a woman is in the period just before, during, and after she's left a dangerous man. The statistics are extraordinary. The rates of violence, including murder, skyrocket during that period because it is her termination of the relationship which implies her right to a life apart from him and thus triggers his desperation and rage. I've also waited to speak of Maggie because I wanted you to form a mental picture of her. What do you see? Is she small and shy, easily intimidated? Is she conventional in her views about gender and relationships with men? Submissive and compliant, eager to please? Weak and helpless and possibly not very bright? The most surprising and revealing part of my research for the book that I wrote on this event was in the way Maggie's friends explained why they, like most of our campus, were unwilling to see her death as an example of violence against women. They couldn't bear to think of her, or to have others think of her, as weak or as a victim. One of those pitiful weak women who get pushed around or beaten or killed by their ex-boyfriends, the victim we all love to blame. There is no more harmful stereotype than this one if we want to understand and to stop the epidemic of violence against women. Women don't get beaten and killed because they are weak, or because they are bitchy, or because they're sexually unfaithful, or because they are anything. They are beaten and killed because there is something wrong with their partners. That's why I've told you so much about Nina. What I can tell you about Maggie is that she was strong, athletic, opinionated, snarky, funny, outgoing, and very, very smart. She came to K trailing awards and prizes. She was an athlete and a musician and had just jumped the pre-med ship and fallen in love with history. She planned to study abroad in Germany, where she had family, and go on to law school. Professor Barclay thought she was the most promising history student to come down the pike in years, a true academic star in the making. Above all, Maggie was compassionate. She made friends easily, kept friends faithfully, and was one of those people who were there for you. Everybody with problems came to Maggie. Everybody said so. It may be her compassion and empathy that kept her connected enough to Nina, sorry enough for his suffering, to endure his verbal abuse and go to his room on the night of October 18th, when he asked her to come over and read something. She told her roommate she'd be gone 10 minutes. Every year in the U.S., over 1,000 women are killed by intimate partners, and that category includes boyfriends, husbands, and exes. Around 20% of the time, the perpetrator then kills himself. 74% of murder-suicides involve intimate partners or exes, and of these, well over 90% involve female victims and male perpetrators. The scenario is virtually always the same, so I'll quote here from a report of the Violence Policy Center of the U.S. He typically develops suspicions of his girlfriend's or wife's infidelity, becomes enraged, murders her, and then commits suicide. So, as extraordinary as those shotgun blasts were on our little campus, what happened that night followed a very typical and common pattern. We had a lot of trouble talking about that pattern 13 years ago. It's hard to talk about male violence against women without seeming to say that men are the enemy or that all men are abusers. And men certainly are not. But women's lives are shaped from childhood by the danger of male violence. We all know it, although we never talk about it. Femicide, the killing of women, is only the far end of the spectrum of violence that is a part of millions and millions of women's lives, whether they experience it personally, or through loved ones, or see it everywhere in the culture around them, from ads to movies to books to porn, to jokes at parties, to their own fear on the streets and in parking garages and elevators. But statistically, the very most dangerous place a woman can be is her own place of residence. Because statistically, the person most likely to harm her lives there, or used to live there, or has easy access. 13 years ago, it was also hard to talk about Maggie's death as a typical example of violence against women, because this seemed to many of Nino's many friends to diminish his death, and to cast him as a monster instead of the gentle, kind, funny, sad guy they knew. And this may be my most important message. To be able to talk about October 18th, to make it part of our story, really, and above all, to keep it from happening again, we have to be able to talk about Nina as a perpetrator of the extreme form of violence against women, and also as a wounded, gifted human being whose loss was also tragic. We have to know him as a full human being, lovable and much loved, and also a deeply disturbed person who devastated 2 families, a whole campus, and a world of friends. That is, we have to acknowledge his humanity in all of its complexity. His death, like Maggie's, is a great loss. But there was an earlier loss. The loss of the bright-eyed, softly smiling, sweet-spirited, pubescent boy I first saw in the photo on his green card, his resident alien card. How did that boy get turned into the seething mass of fear, hopelessness, and rage, who wrote to a friend on October 14th, "I got screwed by a girl I was with for 8 months, so I do hate girls and think they're all bitches." By then, the rifle was already hidden in his room. In the weeks and months after October 18th, 1999, stories came out of the woodwork. Several of us on the faculty and staff talked to students who were fearful about their own relationships or those of a friend. And yet it took 2 deaths to bring these stories into the open. Remember that many people had heard Maggie and Nina fighting, knew the names he called, or knew he was depressed. At least one person even knew he'd tried to buy a gun that summer. The people who were worried about Maggie or Nina were other students. And yet nobody went to an RA, or a dean of students, or a college counselor, or a faculty member, or a security officer and said, "I'm worried, I think Maggie's in trouble," or "I'm scared about Nina, I think he's suicidal." People have asked me a lot, do you think it could have been prevented? To answer that honestly, I could talk about having sane gun laws in this country. I could talk about a culture in which boys would be socialized very differently, not constantly encouraged to embrace violence, deny difficult feelings, and prove themselves real men by dissing, objectifying, and controlling women. This system damages them as well as the women they hurt. After all, it killed Nina as surely as it killed Maggie. I could talk about a culture in which girls are not force-fed crazy-making, conflicting messages. Be strong and independent, but also be hot and sexually available. Be assertive, but whatever you do, do not be bitchy. Above all, make sure you're always in a relationship. no matter how crummy or hurtful or frightening that relationship gets. But I might also answer the question of whether these deaths could have been prevented by talking about what community means. I think there's a code of silence that allows us to keep each other's secrets, ignore each other's danger, and do it all in the name of respecting individual privacy. What community has got to mean is interdependence. If we hear of verbal violence, we don't call it normal. We investigate and call for help. If we know a woman who's afraid of her boyfriend, we don't leave it up to her to come to her senses or leave it to him to get a grip. If a friend is leaving a relationship that might be dangerous, we form a support system and a safety net. If we know someone severely depressed or talking about suicide, we tell somebody. We ask for help. Above all, we ask for help. We call on the resources of this community to help us. A week after Maggie's death, I put together the list of warning signs you received today on, I think, a purple sheet of paper. It comes from many reliable sources I've used in my own research and teaching, though the words are mine. I'm surprised by how often former students mention this list, not knowing I produced it. It stuck with them. I think it might be because it identifies behaviors that we are taught to think of as normal and calls them not normal, dangerous. Maggie's friends recall reading this list and identifying Nina for almost every item on it. If they had had it 3 weeks earlier, would things have been different? We can't possibly know. But that's why it's in your hands today, and why I'm speaking, so that maybe the nightmare of October 18th can produce the dream of a different future. I hope you'll read it and think about it. I hope you'll post it and give it to friends and family. And I hope you'll join us now for a brief ceremony of remembrance outside at Maggie's bench. In the days and years to come, when you pass the bench, maybe you'll think of her. She might have been one of you. She was one of you. But so was Nina. They were part of us, all of us. If we want to live together in a respectful and compassionate community, as a college, as a country, as a planet, their story will be part of ours. Thank you.